Otto Scharmer is a senior lecturer at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a co-founder of the Presencing Institute and the MIT XU Lab. He authored Theory U and the Essentials of Theory U, and also created the famous U process. He will talk about COVID, climate, and consciousness, how to reimagine our civilization. Otto, welcome.
Thank you so much, Bence. And it was great to listen in into the tail end or second part of your talk, Gail. I'm sorry that I missed the first part. Maybe I can look that up some other place. What I wanted to contribute, what Bence and I discussed, what might be helpful is to share a little bit of my observations on the current situation, just blending with Gail's remarks. And I have 7 observations or sentences or points, if you want, that I would like to share. And then maybe from there, we can move into a little breakout conversation and then into a plenary dialogue. So the first one, and since I missed the first part of Gail, so I will, she may have covered these things already, but the first, one we all see, of course, the first observation is that the COVID-19 situation is really a systems thinking teacher for us, right? So maybe we read that some other place before, right? We are the system, and so we are all connected, the principle of interdependency, but now we know. And so that's a significant moment, because so now kind of we as a global community really have a visceral sense of that. And let me just share the screen for a little moment here. So what you see here is, of course, something you have seen many times, kind of the systems thinking depicted as an iceberg. But in this way, something that I and my colleagues refer to as awareness-based systems change. It starts with the same distinction all systems change and systems thinking approach start, which is the distinction between symptoms at the top and root issues at the bottom. And in this case, the root issues are differentiated according to structures, mental models, or paradigms of thought, if you want, and then sources. Sources of what? Sources of our attention, sources of our intention, sources of our creativity, individual and collective, sources of ourself. And so you could also, the fourth one, kind of the source, could have been also labeled as awareness or consciousness, right? So this together is basically awareness-based systems change or consciousness-based systems change. And the 3 sentences that, in my view, kind of summarize this approach are: you cannot understand a system unless you change it. Kurt Lewin, famously, the founder of Action Research. And, the reason why, I went from Europe here to Boston in the US to learn about this tradition and how to engage in it in a more helpful way. Secondly, you cannot change a system unless you transform consciousness. So a different way of saying it is, you cannot change a system unless you really address all 4 of these layers, right? Kind of what's above, the water line, but also the 3 layers below. And that sentence certainly summarizes my experience of the past 20 years as an action researcher, or past 25 years, actually. And it also, summarizes a lot of the change episodes that we have seen in the system and that I have studied. And then the third sentence is, so if we just assume for a moment this to be true, so then the question, of course, is how? How do we do that? you cannot transform consciousness unless you make a system see and sense itself. So that shift, of course, we know that from interpersonal work, right? So that's what coaching is about, right? Looking into the mirror. I mean, so all behavioral change has that component, we know that, but on a whole systems level, you know, we often don't really make use of that, among others, because we miss the methods and tools. There are tools, of course, that sometimes are used, and traditionally in systems thinking, we would have said this: you cannot transform a system, let's say in this case it's consciousness, unless you make a system see itself. But you know, you use systems modeling, lots of mapping techniques and so on. So that has been always the hallmark of systems-based intervention. But what we learned really over the past decade or two is this: so that's not good enough, because if you just see what's broken, if you just see the knowing-doing gap, you're just replicating it, right? You're not transforming it. The only way, if on a collective level, the problem today is, you know, that we basically we know all the solutions, but we are not implementing that. So the decoupling of the head and the hand, the only way of addressing that is activating the knowing of the heart. And that brings us to the second verb here, the sensing. So intervention techniques, therefore, if I don't feel the pain of the other, then, you know, it's still stuck in my head. Then I'm not able to bridge the knowing-doing gap. So that's a little bit like the backdrop in methodology. And the second, so we are the system is the first point and the first observation. The second one is, when disruption hits, you have a choice, right? You have a choice in how you respond. And basically, the choice is that we can turn away and closing down, or turn toward and opening up. Turn away and closing down is basically a freeze reaction of the human mind. So closing the mind, heart, will, aka ignorance, hate, and fear. While in order to lean into something that we don't know requires us to access these sources of intelligence, opening the mind, opening the heart, opening the will, aka curiosity, compassion, courage. That's, of course, what most of us, whenever we do something, right, be that with the U process or other methods of awareness-based systems change. So that's our focus, right? That's what we are there for. That's our job, right? Kind of strengthening these capacities. But what we also see going on is a lot of this stuff on the upper half that I refer to not with the term presencing, but absencing. So it's basically, so if this process down here is seeing, sensing, presencing, this is blinding, not seeing, right? So desensing, not feeling, numbing, right? So that's the trauma process, right? So we are splitting something off, and then absencing is not connecting with our highest future possibilities. And that results in blaming, abuse, and destruction, which really, you know, I think kind of this is an older slide apparently. So it should be self-destruction, right? Because that destruction really leads into self-destruction, which is of course what we see. So that's a little bit the choice that we have. Whenever disruption hits, the choice for us is, how are we going to respond? By leaning in here, or by closing down, leaning in and opening up, or by turning away, closing down by a freeze reaction. And what we learn in the current Corona situation is that it matters. So these are two inner places that we can respond from, right? And I would say that basically what we have seen, the great amplification of this phenomenon up here, kind of the absencing phenomenon, Trumpism. You may wonder, well, why is that? Why do we see such a strengthening of that over the past few years? And one way of looking at that, it's the result of two factors, which is one, disruption happens, and two, lack of capacity to access these deeper resources. And when you're overwhelmed by a situation, when you live in a context where you never really develop these deeper capacities, then life is throwing you into this space. So that's a little bit the situation that we are dealing with. And yesterday here in the US, we hit the 100,000 COVID-19 deaths. So we have a population here of 330 million. And when you go to East Asia, Asia Pacific, you have 6 countries that have approximately exactly the same population. And that is Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam. So they have 328 million. So here in the US, it's 330. Almost the same. We have 100,000 COVID deaths here. In East Asia, the same amount of people, you have 1,200. So 1.2%. If we had responded to this situation here 2 weeks earlier, we according to models, probably would have saved 50,000 lives. So whether in a situation, right, in terms of systems leadership, you turn this way or you turn that way, has real world consequences. The first case of COVID-19 in Korea and the United States happened on the same day, but then the response was quite different. In that way, we can say the future is not what happens to us. The future is what we do with what happens to us. And kind of this, 100,000 versus 1,200 is an example. So whether we move into this space or in that space in terms of systems leadership is an example of that. So that's my second sentence, right? So that when disruption hits, we have a choice, right? And the choice is leaning in or closing down, opening up or closing down. The choice is in terms of the inner place from that we respond to a situation. The future is not what happens to us. The future is depending on how we respond to what happens to us. Number 3, the current situation. So what's the third teaching here that we are receiving? The third teaching is that the COVID-19 situation is laying bare everything that is broken in our system, right? We knew it was broken before, the food system, right? The global food system. We knew, so basically from food to the lacking social security, the lacking solidarity really in the economic system here, particularly in the US. So everything is laid bare. And the other day I had with some pioneers of regenerative farming a session, and there were some people from around the world, and then I talked about hyper, which is what we see in food, right? So hyper localization and hyper regionalization, right? As a result. But then one of them, shared what's going on across countries, and also as a result. And he said, what is complementing this hyperlocal and hyper-regionalization is hyper-brutalization, right? So it's kind of the absencing response. And that we also see playing out in a number of systems. And that's part of the same question. So that is part of the same phenomenon. So we have kind of this dual response. So on the one hand, the deepening, in terms of the opening, accessing curiosity, compassion, and so forth, but also the hyper-brutalization. Number 4, in spite of all these things, an outpouring surge of compassionate action. So that is in the neighborhood, that is, the essential workers. There is, we see an amazing, so as systems collapse, so I mean, I can say that here from the US perspective, but that's different in different parts of the world. I'm aware of that. But to the degree that systems collapse, and we live in a time where systems are, increasingly collapsing or malfunctioning. As systems collapse, people rise. So this outpouring of compassionate action is one phenomenon here. And the other phenomenon is an even much more significant amount of unused energy for positive change. So I want to share a little data point, because I think that in a way is the most remarkable observation of something that is right now a pure potential. We see this potential being actualized in small ways, but I believe, and that's really my main point of my little observations here, I believe that there is so much more potential not yet fully catalyzed for positive change. So most people, I would say, would, at least kind of in the bubbles that I'm around, that I am connected with, in a number of places. When I look back, the conversation has really shifted, right? The past few months compared to the 5 or 10 years earlier. Today, most people that I meet, regardless whether they're at top leadership positions in governments, companies, or whether they're like grassroots activists, most people would agree to the following 3 sentences. 1, the current system is broken. We know it's unsustainable, right? It's hitting the wall. And that process of hitting the wall is already happening. Everyone knows that, feels that. Not everyone, but most people. 2, I want to be part of a different story. Right? So yes, I'm part of this old machine still, right? But in reality, I truly want to, if I had a choice, right? So I want to be part of a different story of the future. 3, I don't know how. I think that's those 3 things together. That's like a pointing at this potential. And so that's what prompted me and some colleagues to launch, back in March. Well, what do you mean? It's not really launching. I wrote a blog and I suggested, look, something like this is happening. We should actually create like a deep learning journey, a deep learning infrastructure for folks who want to explore this space of potential change, reimagining our civilization. Right? So how reimagining not only my own path forward, yes, that's part of it, but also the civilization. Within 12 days after posting that thing, we had more than 10,000 people sign up. And more importantly, a volunteer group of more than 100 people who actually helped kind of putting this up. And that, the headline for that is Gaia, Global Activation of Intention and Action. And so it is like a global experiment of awareness-based systems, of an awareness-based systems change intervention. So let me just show just a quick piece on that. And Wait a second. So GaiaJourney.org, so that takes you there. So we had every week, more than 7,000 people, joining in on practices. And then, deep listening practice, mindfulness practices, bringing in social arts, but basically listening to each other and then applying these, that's the inhale, and then in the exhale, the other week, applying these practices in your own local context. So we had Aboriginal leaders, the Bhutan GNH story, Kapra, Vandana Shiva, John Kabat-Zinn, Arana with her social presencing theater, kind of collective trauma with Thomas, and others. Thomas, we had Frederick Laloux, and a bunch of other, and basically coming in and being part of this conversation. What are we called to do? And kind of this moment, really, what is it? What is mine? So where is my place kind of in this bigger transformation journey that we are part of? So many of them engage in social solidarity circles, so small circles. So there's a little bit on the head, the content, then there's the circle work, the deep listening, and then the hubs about the change. And so in this, so we are now like from the deep listening to the deep resonance, we are now kind of at this point where we move into the change of prototyping, kind of locally, kind of crystallizing the seeds of change locally. But what we are seeing is an enormous body of resonance where people experience what they have thought as an abstract thought before, right? Suddenly they feel as a social emotional field that resonates kind of with, that connects, that helps them kind of with their own process of opening their heart and connecting with their own deeper sources of intention. And now we are just at the intersection of kind of the crystallizing, beginning to crystallize your own intention, then moving that into maybe prototypes that are connected with each other. So it's not yet clear really where that will lead to, but what is very clear is the enormous potential and energy that is just being called in the moment you only kind of create a space of listening, where what's going on the deeper levels of the experience that we already have. So where we pay attention to that and help each other to bring that to our attention and to align our attention with our intention, both on the level of the individual and on the level of the collective. So that's, I would say, the fourth one, kind of that this experience. And so when we started that journey, one of the participants, articulated really the current moment beautifully when she said, everything that I have experienced in my life has prepared me for this moment. Everything I have experienced in my life so far has prepared me for this moment. So this statement is a little bit like, it resonates with me because number one, I feel it's also true for me, right? So that's exactly how I feel. And two, I feel that is also true for us collectively as a movement. So that, we have been part of a larger movement where some people do environmental things, and then, we have climate, we have all the social issues, we have all the consciousness people, and, often, for many years since talk to Capra, for many years, these things have been going on, and often in separate strands, right? Separate communities, not connected to each other. We are now in a moment where the ecological, the social, the spiritual, the consciousness dimension really begin to come together, and where that is a very natural phenomenon. So that's really my my fourth point. Kind of, it's a felt sense. So it's not an abstract, proposition, but it's a felt sense that is summarized in that sentence. Everything I've experienced in my life has prepared me for this moment now. 5. Okay, so what are we called to do now, right? So leaning into this space, really, what does that lead to? And how is it that we can respond to the current situation in a way that is basically strengthening this capacity? And of course, we know that one part of that is our individual cultivation, right? So that's part of it. But even though that's very important, it's not sufficient. And so it is necessary, but not sufficient. And what's also called for, I believe, is a response on the level of the collective that is, allowing us to respond to the current situation by innovations in infrastructures on 3 different levels: new learning infrastructures, new democratic infrastructures, and new economic infrastructures. So new learning infrastructures is basically whole person, whole systems, infrastructures that allow us to move towards whole persons, whole systems learning. New democratic and governance infrastructures basically make democracy more participatory, more direct, distributed, and dialogic. And new economic infrastructures basically facilitating. There's a lot of talk about the new economy, but whatever it is, it always requires new collaborative capacities. So we need to rethink and redesign our economic institutions from a paradigm that's organized around ecosystem awareness, which is our current economy, to one that's organized around ecosystem awareness, by which I mean an awareness that is focusing on the well-being of all. So that's, I would say, the call, innovations and infrastructures. And so that's less an observation, that's more a proposition. So that's my point number 5. And point number 6 is school for transformation. So to really make this thing happening here, kind of the learning infrastructures, what does that really mean? So when you look at this is kind of a 1-page summary of what I see going on in learning and leadership, not only in the education system, but in all institution systems today. When you see 2 things are going on: deepening of the learning cycle, right? From head-centric to head and hand to head, heart, and hand, transformational learning, basically, whole person, on the one hand. And on the other hand, who is learning, right? From individual to collective, right? Team, organization, ecosystem. So where do all the resources go today? Ask yourself, where is it? And of course, we all know, right? It's the bottom left. It's those 1, 2, 3, 4. 4, I mean, it's already very good. Often it's only 3 of these pieces there. And where's the blind spot, right? It's in the top right. It's transformational learning in general, in particular when it comes to the collective level, kind of to the ecosystem level. What do we mean with ecosystem? All the people you need, all the stakeholders you need to change the system. So that's where we are, bottom left today, and that's where we need to go, top right, or rather the entire matrix, and not only down here. And to do that, I think we need to prototype that, because it's not just happening gradually. You need kind of radical experiments, and that's something. So that's my point number 6: school for transformation. Right, a school for transformation that basically is democratizing the access to transformation literacy. We move into a period of massive transformation, where transformation needs to happen on a massive scale, on a civilizational scale. And what's not there? Transformation literacy, particularly vertical transformation literacy. By integrating science, consciousness, social art and technologies, and societal transformation. Now, how does that show up kind of in the real world, kind of locally, in regions, and also in countries and globally? Basically by updating the operating system, right, from something I call 1.0 and 2.0, which is input and authority-centric or output and efficiency-centric, to this 3.0 and 4.0, by which I mean outcome and user-centric, 3.0, or co-creative and ecosystem-centric. And so you can go through the learning, so all the different sectors, and they basically go through all these shifts, right? From teaching by testing to learner-centric to activate the deep learning cycle, or in health, evidence-based to patient-centric to strengthening the sources of well-being. And, you know, in farming, we have industrial agriculture to organic, right? Reduce negative footprint, that's good, but not good enough. So regenerative in terms of food as medium for healing planet and people. And then in sustainability, we go from efficiency to business innovation to mission-driven enterprises, and finance from externality blind, think Wall Street, impact investing, that's better, but usually not systemic at all, because it's missing the deeper root issues, to regenerative, right? So where you really focus on the deeper systems transformation. And all of that embedded in the evolution of governance, right? From the visible hand, the invisible hand, towards, what we have now, kind of organized interest groups, to awareness-based collective action, where we really put shared awareness into the center of the coordination of a system, which is in an interesting way what happened in COVID. Usually it happens locally, right? So when you organize around commons, and rarely it happens globally. We saw it in Paris with the Paris Agreement a little bit. We see it a little bit now, but it's a capacity that we need to develop a lot more. And that requires kind of a school for transformation to really bring in the vertical transformation literacy into the movement that's already there, right? The movement is there, but often it's too reactive, as Gaia was also pointing out, kind of, so we are just trying to scare people. That doesn't help really. But what we need to do is to align collective attention and collective intention in a more conscious way. And I think that's the call of our time. So with that, I would now invite you to maybe take a moment. So those are like 7 random observations from my end. Some of them may have resonated with you because you saw that before. Some of that may be interesting. It's an interesting angle. Some of that may be different in your context. So take a moment and just connect to the resonance of everything that I just said. Everything that I have experienced in my life has prepared me for this moment now. What is it for you? What is it that you sense in this moment that's happening? And what are you called to do? So with those two questions, I suggest we go into, I don't know, Bence, how long, maybe 10 minutes or something, into breakout groups, and just go around and kind of, you know, share a little bit the resonance that you feel in this moment, evoked by maybe some of the remarks from Gail and myself, or from other experiences you bring into this conversation. And when you follow the trail of that question, everything that I experienced in my life has prepared me for this moment. What is that moment for you? So what is that moment calling you to do? What's kind of the call of the future that you are sensing in your life, right? And it's very personal, right? It's not always kind of these big abstract things. It's personal, but it may also have like a collective dimension. What is it, right? So that's really our job now, so that we follow the question, okay, in all of these bigger things, what is mine to do? Enjoy the conversation, share what's on your mind. We'll take 10 or so minutes for that. And
10 minutes is perfect. We have 21 till finishing.
Excellent.
So
I will set up the rooms now. You're going to automatically get sent to a breakout room, and there will be a 10-minute timer clock at the top, and I will bring you back at the end. So enjoy your breakout room. Any problems, please do raise your hand and I can come into your rooms and help. Reason it is not working. Let me try again. Sorry. Okay, we seem to have a technological issue. It is not letting me start the breakout rooms. Let me try one more time.
Yeah, that's not a problem at all. So let's just stay with that same question. So as Chris, you can try it still one more time, but so we'll already continue. So we stay with the same question, not distracted by, disruptions that are always coming one way or another, and share what's coming up for you in the chat. Just put, the resonance. What is it? So the two questions I ask is, what is it? Kind of, what's the resonance? What resonance do you feel kind of after Gail's remarks and mine? What is it that you sense going on? And in terms of the call of the future, what do you feel called to do now? Obviously, this is a conversation, right? We can only answer these things in a conversation, but we start this conversation with the chat now. So just put your sentence or two into the chat. And then when you have done so, kind of keep reading what's coming up in the chat. It's quite wonderful. Feeling being part of something bigger than me, and I feel the need to allow that community to happen. So here's what I propose. If in fact we should not be put into breakout groups, I propose that we, take a little moment and read all the wonderful, but sometimes it's going so quick. It's hard to decipher all these things. So let's move now the experiment into a collective self-navigation here. And I'm going to invite you to just unmute your, so those of you who feel drawn to share their sentence or two, right? What you sense kind of the resonance that you feel right now in this moment, what you sense going on, and the call of the time that you feel. Just kind of keep it short to a sentence or two. And when you feel moved to share it, unmute and share it. And let's kind of make sure that we all keep the whole in mind, that everyone that we share around the airtime here. So unmute and share your sentence or two, and then allow someone else to do the same.
Quick question, Otto, in terms of process, are you okay with using the raised hand feature, which is more adapted to such a size of group? That for you?
Usually that's what we do. I would just suggest kind of that we do it collectively. So we, yes. The way I suggest it, let's just kind of, lean into it. Let's be a little bit more risky here and experimental, and we can self-navigate.
And Otto, I'm afraid we have to wrap up this beautiful hour with you. So any last comments that you would make, or last messages to the group before we part?
Well, Dumi and everyone, thank you so much for, I really appreciated this sharing. We saw that we can actually work without central coordination just by, shared awareness together. So it is working. And what I loved most about that was, I mean, the inner place everyone was speaking from, and the listening. It was not, okay, so now, so the moment you stop, I will bring in my speech, and then instead of listen, I prepare for that. There was a real, we just felt that, we all, right? That's what can, so that shared space of listening and speaking from these deeper places and being together, that is the only thing that gives us hope. And that is the most important gateway into the future. That's what we need to cultivate. And whatever I think, or the initiatives that you mentioned are actually, the way I was listening to that, they're all part of a much, they're not just some change from some person here or there. So we are all part of a movement that is, in a very intentional way, seeding a civilizational change that is going to reshape not only this decade, but the remainder of the century. Because in reality, we know that these civilizational changes, they go over multiple generations, right? So that's kind of the intention we are holding now in putting in this infrastructures. And how does the new come into being? Small, it's very personal. It is all these things you are just articulating. And it's also place-based. It's often place-based, right? So that's why, and we also know that no change in the social realm ever has done by individuals, right? So the only way of doing it is the social field. So the real strategic question, I think, for each of us is really, how do we create these small, and it doesn't matter when they start small, but the kind of how and where do we find people with whom we succeed to activate the generative social field? That's the question, because if we do that, that's the direct gateway into the emerging future. And it happens in many places locally, and we just need to wake up to that. And then, yes, we need these digital ways of connecting with each other globally, but that will never, ever substitute, right, the embodied experience we have on the ground. So that's just, a way of how I was listening to what you were saying, that we are all connected in that. And so that we need each other's listening and support to move these things forward. But because at the end of the day, anyone can articulate new ideas. New ideas are cheap, right? So, but what we really need is the opening of the heart and the connection to the hand, kind of. And I think we all just felt a small version of that. So many ways that our multi-phased movement has. yeah, that's all I have to say. Thank you. Thank you, Bence, for bringing me in.
Thank you, Otto, and thank you for creating this open-handed, open-hearted, bright-minded atmosphere. I think we really felt it together, this experience. And I agree with you that the best is to meet in person. So it's no secret that we also have you invited as a keynote speaker for 2021, the live IEC. So I really hope that finally we will meet in person there too. So thank you for coming, and I hand over to Mo.